Welcome, everybody. This is the third and final of our three-part series on the matriarchs, originally proposed by Wendy Jordan, who is right here in this Zoom room, and shepherded by our education committee. So thank you to all of those mothers of the matriarchs class. I'm going to do a little bit of review since not everybody has been in every session. But today we're mostly going to focus on that third generation of the matriarchs, Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah. We'll start with our Torah prayer, so please join me. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you for the inspiration to immerse ourselves in Jewish learning. Amen. For this series, we've been using the lens of these matriarchs as human beings who faced what they had to face in their lives in the best way possible. Not demigods, not models for what we should do, not saints, unlike in some other traditions, but human beings who lived lives just like we need to live. And that's what the matriarchs give us. They give us that gift of human beings who struggled with whatever they had to face in their context, just like each one of us does. They made mistakes, they learned things, they did repair at times. Midrash did more repair and imagination to kind of develop the Jewish tradition from the original stories. And we're using that lens. In our earlier classes, we've looked at how, from the very earliest Jewish families, looking at the life of Sarah, Jewish families were incredibly complex. From the very beginning, there were family dynamics and struggles and tensions. And I think all of us have experienced the truth of family life through the generations has complexities, and that we're given that truth as our foundational stories. And also that from the very beginning of Jewish tradition in Sarah's family, along with Hagar and Yishmael and Isaac, Yitzhak, Jewish families were very diverse. It's kind of interesting because from that first generation, families were already interfaith. Right? Like when Abraham takes Hagar as a partner, that becomes an interfaith collection. So from the very first generation, Jewish families were already interfaith. Isn't that interesting, given that there was a lot of, kind of traditional protest against people marrying outside of Judaism. But even in the original Jewish family, there was marriage beyond the Jewish tribe and procreation beyond the Jewish tribe. So really interesting. Now, in that first class, we looked at the intriguing theory that Sarah might actually have been a priestess in the old mother goddess religion, and that she had an interest in passing that on through her generations. We traced that theme into the generation of Rebekah, when we looked at how important it was in all of those foundational stories to find a mate for your child from the old goddess worshiping culture. And we looked at the story of how Abraham sent his messenger Eliezer to find a wife for Isaac, who turns out to be Rebekah. And as a possible clue that Sarah was protecting her own cultural heritage there as a mother worshiper, but also throwing in her lot with the Jewish story. And we're going to trace that theme into this third generation also, because these are kind of bits of evidence. Nobody really knows what was true back then. So it's all this interpretation and that interpretation. But based on what we do have, there's a very legitimate scholarly perspective that Sarah could have been a priestess, and that these things that we're looking at, like finding a wife back from her part of the world with her culture, was an important part of her practice. And we will follow that into this next generation. And let's see, we've also traced the theme of the different kinds of agency. Women having a lot of agency in the domestic private realm to shape their families and to shape the future of Judaism, even though women did not have any public stature. All of the key characters were men. And basically the Torah and the rabbis were speaking to men about men, and women were very peripheral. And yet we know from these very same stories that women actually were taking a lot of power in the private realm. So these are some of the themes we've been tracing so far. We're going to continue tracing them into this generation. Who here was able to study the stories about Rachel? Just raise your hand here, Rachel, Leah, the folks. Yay. Okay. And all of us are pretty familiar with these stories because we encountered them every year in the sacred cycle of our Torah reading. And some of them are also present in our holy days as readings. So who would like to tell the story of the trickery involved in Jacob's marital affairs that actually ended up ensnaring Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah as the years went by? Who would like to just tell, summarize the story for us? Let's have a Torah tale here. Some brave soul. I'll start you off. Okay, Bobby, good. Bobby's going to go.
Okay, but you need to correct me when I say something wrong, because I likely will. So Rachel and Leah were sisters, and supposedly Rachel was the more physically beautiful of the two. And Leah, was Leah the one, she had something with her eyes were funny? Okay.
She had weak eyes.
Yeah. So Leah was supposed to be the one to marry Jacob, but Jacob really was in love with Rachel. And when I think the deal was when he was supposed to marry Rachel, instead, the mother pushed Leah in, and he ended up marrying Leah. Was that right?
I think Laban, the
Right.
male relative. Yeah.
Right. So you're right. Okay, I'll stop there.
Okay, so surprise, Jacob woke up the next day and he had married Leah. And if you think about it, in a very traditional Jewish wedding, the women are fully veiled and you can't even see, nobody can really see who is who. When I do a wedding today, I tell the couple, a lot of times I tell them this story about two people who were tricked into marrying each other. And then I say, and so our sages have taught since then, you have to see who you're going to marry. And that's like the lifting of the veil. It's like a moment, bedecken of veiling, unveiling, kind of comes directly from this story. If you don't want to be tricked, you want to see who you're marrying in both directions. That is exactly right. So originally, this was another case of needing to find a wife for Jacob from the country that, the cultural tradition of Sarah's lineage, which was mother goddess worshiping. They worshiped the great mother, and they were kind of fertility connected to the agricultural cycle of the year, the seasons. And Jacob goes to look for the wife, and he and Rachel fall in love with this very kind act that appeals to him, which is that if you're in a desert, the most important thing is to have water. And she kindly agrees to water the stranger's animals, which is about the kindest thing you can do. So it was like a very noticeable act of a mitzvah. And Jacob and Rachel immediately fall in love. And Laban, who's their relative, says, well, Jacob, you can work for me for 7 years and you can win this wife. And Jacob does work for 7 years. And then there's the trickery. Now, remember what Jacob was coming off of? What was Jacob's earlier experience? Like what was the earlier round of Jacob's life story? because if you will remember, it involved a huge amount of treachery and trickery. Let's situate Jacob here. What had just happened in Jacob's life prior to this? Ed.
Well, like Rachel, Jacob was the younger of two siblings, twins, and he was the second born of the two. So he's arranged with Laban to marry Rachel, which upsets the order for the firstborn in their generation, as he and his mother Rebekah upset the order of blessing in his generation. I don't know if
Absolutely.
that's where you wanted me to go.
Absolutely. So there was the upending of the natural order of practice, but also there was the repetition of this trickery, right? Because in Jacob's earlier life, he and his mother, Rebekah, had basically tricked Isaac, his father, Rebekah's husband, into giving the blessing of the firstborn to the younger son, which was not the regular way of doing it. It was trickery. Remember the fur on Jacob's skin? He had basically stolen the blessing of the first right with the collusion of his own mother. And so what we see is what goes around comes around. In this next story, there's trickery in the other direction. Jacob gets really pretty seriously shocked and tricked. And, we can interpret this now today with the idea of that people who experience trauma many times traumatize others, that there's a repetition compulsion, that if you haven't healed and worked through what you were given that was painful and too much for you to bear back then, if you haven't worked that through and healed, you are likely to repeat that dynamic in some way, shape, or form. And I will venture so far as to say right now in the Middle East, we're seeing a lot of this repetition compulsion where people who are living in trauma from unhealed, horrible tragedy are now perpetrating that tragedy in a different way, shape, and form on a different side of that dynamic. But that's that idea of repetition compulsion, of trauma recreating trauma. We see it in these very early biblical stories. We see Jacob having been raised in a family that involved really betrayal and sneakiness and theft, then getting treated in those ways in the next experience in his life. So in one case, he's kind of the perpetrator. In the other case, he's the victim. But it's the exact same dynamic. And we see that people can take either side of those dynamics. You don't necessarily perpetrate the same side of the dynamic you experienced. You might very well perpetrate the opposite side. So there are cases where people who are, abused as kids then become abusers, that kind of thing. I see Paul, who's lived in the world of therapy a lot, really nodding his head there, because these are very well studied dynamics. And we get these in our earliest biblical stories, such insight, such kind of truth telling about how life works in some way. So let me stop there for a minute, see if anybody wants to comment on that, and then there's more to be said. Anybody have a comment on repetition compulsion, trauma perpetuating trauma? Paul?
Well, I'm so glad you brought that in, because it might even be helpful to us as a congregation. Yes, because Israel has PTSD. I mean, I'm only saying that because they have had such terrible things happen. Yeah. And in my work, it's interesting, some of those people who were bullied, abused, violated, their reaction is, it's understandable, but sometimes it's really unfortunate because it perpetuates the cycle of either violence or abuse or victimization, exactly what you said. So yeah. I'm so glad, because for me, it helps me to have empathy for the person or the country who has been abused, but then it also allows me to have empathy for the backlash and the fallout, because otherwise I'm not also finding some kind of balance in that trauma. So I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
And thank
I'm
you,
sorry.
Paul. Yeah, and it can happen on an individual level for in an individual life experience, or it can happen on a political level with entire countries. Like if you look at countries that were colonized in very oppressive ways in Africa and then get their freedom, but are very abusive then to their own people. So it can happen in the life of an individual to perpetrate and re-traumatize from the other position, usually, the position of power, or it can happen on political levels. It's also
Absolutely. I just,
really possible to interrupt and heal trauma. Like you don't have to have an endless cycle. And part of what therapists do in working with individuals is to say, look, you have the power to stop passing this on to your next generation. You can heal this. And there's lots of great work that can be done about trauma, and also politically. Like South Africa politically mostly didn't perpetuate another generation of trauma. I mean, it's not perfect, there's problems, whatever, but it did a whole process of truth and reconciliation and healing, and refusing to make anybody, outside. Everybody was included in the transformation, and the process of truth and reconciliation really set South Africa on a different path of more or less not recreating an extremely oppressive, racist, whatever, in the opposite direction. Like it could have been in South Africa, Black people became, the dominant ones and then persecuted the white people. And that is not what ended up happening historically. Let's hope it keeps not happening.
I just want to say one more thing. It always got to me when this trickery, times two. When as a little kid, I didn't. It kicked out of my head when I got even older. So I appreciate having to understand it this way too, because when you marry the wrong person, or you stick the brother that with the hairy. I always remember that, the hairy arm or something. It's like, that's written down. It's like, I don't like that. I don't like that, my ancestors, they just did what they felt was the right thing to do. And we were kind of left with this, not okay, not acceptable. So I appreciate that it's being brought back, and maybe I'll forgive him now. How's that? Maybe I'll find it in myself to say, you did what you had to do.
There's a
right?
complication there, because it was actually Rebekah who masterminded the choice of the younger child, Jacob, stealing the birthright, because Rebekah had some wisdom that this would be the best way to build the family tree, even though she had to, kind of seize power and do something that was disruptive and not according to plan. So it's very complicated. These things are complicated. But I want to go back to Jacob, who ended up, he got tricked into marrying Leah, the older daughter. She did have a disability with her eyes and was the unchosen one always. And then he realized it, and Laban said, well, you can also have the younger daughter, Rachel, because back then men could marry more than one woman. And in that part of the world, many people did, and still, I think, probably do, not in Judaism. But he was supposed to work 7 more years and earn the right of Rachel. There's a whole midrash that the 7 years somehow overlapped, so it was a total of 7 years. He ended up also getting to marry Rachel. Now, I want to pose 3 possibilities for this trickery in that generation, and I want to see which one resonates with you, or which combination. So one possibility is that there was just the systemic plan that the older daughter has to be married first, that it wasn't anything very personal or like sneaky or anything like that. It was just like the standard way it was done. The oldest daughter would be married off first and then successively. I was trying to think of an analogy of what would be systemic and sort of structural, but not personal. I was thinking, well, let's say there's 2 in this world. If there's 2 neighbors and they live together, and there's a family, one of the neighbors has a bunch of little kids, and the other neighbor is a kindergarten teacher. And the kindergarten teacher is kind of close to the 4-year-old in the next door family. But there's also a 5-year-old. And whoever's close to who, and whoever likes who, it's the 5-year-old who's going to go off to kindergarten, because the 5-year-old is first. That's just the way it's done. The 5-year-old goes to kindergarten, the 4-year-old waits a year. That's just systemic. That's the way public education works, right? So that's sort of an example of like, maybe Laban wasn't doing anything mean or sneaky. It's just that in that culture, the oldest daughter got married first. So of course, Leah was going to be married off first. That's one possibility here. I'm going to ask you what you think. Another possibility is that there was a lot of rivalry between the sisters. I don't know how many people here have sisters. I have 4 younger sisters. Okay. So we'll hear some stories about rivalry or not rivalry, but I mean, that's possible that Leah and Rachel had tremendous rivalry, and that, you know, Rachel was in love with Jacob and wanted to make sure she was the one there. That's a possibility. The story's kind of told that way in the Torah. Oh, I don't know why my hand is up there. There we go. Yeah. So that's the second theory, is that there was sibling rivalry between these 2 sisters, Leah and Rachel. And then the third possibility, which is told in Midrash that came later by our sages, that actually the 2 sisters colluded in making sure that Leah was married first. And in that story, it's kind of a story of women's empowerment. Rachel and Leah were actually best friend sisters. And Jacob was in love with Rachel. But Rachel wanted to make sure that her beloved sister got to marry. She had a disability with her eyes, and they were very, very close, and Rachel was committed to her having a family. And that actually, in these stories, Rachel hid under the bed on Jacob and Leah's marital night and used her voice to talk to Jacob so he wouldn't know that it was Leah that he was in bed with. And that they totally colluded, and it was their joint kind of solidarity that ended up with this plan. So 3 completely different frameworks for understanding this story. So I want to open it up and see what speaks to you. Because we know the bare bone facts of what the Torah tells us, but we're trying to kind of have an understanding of, you know, what's going on here. So what speaks to you out of those 3? It's either systemic, or it's sibling rivalry, or it's collusion between the sisters. 3 very different ways of looking at it. Patricia, I see you grinning there. Do you want to speak to that? You can unmute.
I like the third option because, you know, both it respects the order and it shows solidarity between the 2 sisters. And eventually, especially if Rachel gets to marry Jacob also, you know, eventually Jacob gets to also be with Rachel. So, but she at the same time does a favor to her sister. So I like that third option.
You like the story of the solidarity and the
Solidarity of the 2 sisters, yeah.
Yeah. How about other folks? Enid?
Well, I just, if it's true, according to the red tent, Jacob actually slept with all his sisters at one time or another. So maybe that was okay. And then the children, particularly the children of Leah, were always in competition with any of the other children. So it sort of follows the order there. You know, I don't know which option. I mean, the third one is rather cute. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
The truth of the matter, but we'll see.
Okay. So, okay. Who else? Let's have one more. Karen Zeitz. And then Natan, if you had your hand up, you'll be the last one. Oh, okay. Karen Zeitz.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that elder sister, it still existed when I got married, which was in 1970. Because I was the first one, and I know that it put my sister was in graduate school. She was 5 years older. And it did put tremendous pressure on her to get married. And she did get married within like the year. So it wasn't just an ancient thing. It was still going. I don't know if it's still going on, but it was, in my generation, a very real thing that got handed down. And as far as the three stories, I like the third one. I've never heard that one before, but since the Torah was written by men, we don't have the female perspective and the sisterhood perspective of the sisters joining together. It's a different way to look at it, but who knows? It's the first time that a female perspective is given on this story, really.
Yeah. For people who were doing heterosexual marriages, did anybody else feel the pressure to do it in birth order, like you should be married before your younger siblings? Anybody else have that experience? Okay, well, that's really interesting. Yeah. Thank
It
you.
was definitely there.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, well, then, of course, once they're both married to Jacob, they start having Leah starts having babies, and Leah's going to have 6 sons. And of course, sons in that kind of part of the world and culture, sons is what you wanted. Sons were like trophy prizes. I think the girls weren't worth much. They were probably expensive because you had to have dowries for them eventually. And, the sons could actually be economically productive for your family economy. So they all wanted sons. And Leah had always been the unchosen one, the one with the disability, the one no one wanted. But she had this incredible, resource that she had one son after the next. And then the Torah does talk about Rachel and Leah struggling with each other directly because Rachel was jealous. She wanted kids and she was having a really hard time conceiving. And what it speaks to me about, because I'm also drawn to the solidarity story of the sisters colluding, which is the story in Midrash. I like that. I think it's like a great interpretation. But it also speaks to me about how relationships go through eras. Like you could be really close to a sister, and then you could have a period of distance from a sister. And then you could have another period of closeness to a sister. Like I grew up in this family of 5 daughters, very close in age. I'm the oldest. And I had a very close best friend, 11 months younger than me, my sister. And we grew up like this, like really best friends. But then in our 20s, we had a lot of distance. I mean, not hostility really, but like just we were each building our own lives and kind of trying to stand on our own feet. And we lived in different places eventually in our 20s. And it was when I started having kids that we kind of reconnected into very, very close connection. She is a psychiatrist in New York, and she lived with me during her internship and residency. And we're very close. We have a weekly phone date. We see each other all the time. And I'm close to my other sisters as well. But that sister in particular is a best friend sister. And you go through eras, you go through ups and downs. Around the death of our parents, it drew all of us together as we kind of wrapped around them. I think a lot of people can, resonate with that there are eras in relationships. And so whatever Leah and Rachel had in their earlier life, they did go through a really hard period. We know that around fertility and who got babies and who didn't get babies and how that was going to work. And that's where Bilhah and Zilpah, the handmaidens, come into the story. So does anybody want to recount how Bilhah and Zilpah come into the story? Okay, well, we know from the story of Abraham and Sarah that it was a custom that people, the men could be procreative with other women besides their one and only wife. And that was a standard practice. And in many cases, the women suggested it. And so it was Rachel who actually suggested to Jacob, why don't, my handmaiden Bilhah, why don't you, sow your seed with her, because I'm having a lot of trouble getting pregnant. And then Leah's handmaiden was Zilpah, and that also, they kind of are in this rivalry. And so Jacob is making babies with both Bilhah and Zilpah. And let's talk about that, because, Jacob is the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, right? Plus he had a daughter, Dinah, who had a very tragic, horrible life. But Jacob ends up the papa of the 12 tribes of Israel who go on to be the Jewish people. And we're called the people of Jacob because it comes from those kids. And some of those kids were born from Leah, and some of those kids eventually were born from Rachel. We'll talk about that. But some of those kids were born from Bilhah and Zilpah, who were also mothers of the Jewish tribes. So when we talk about the matriarchs, do you think we should be including Bilhah and Zilpah as also the founding mothers of Judaism? Because in our prayers that we say all through the week, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebekah, Leah, and Rachel. What do you think about Bilhah and Zilpah? And why do you think they weren't included? Bobby.
So I have a question out of ignorance because I can never remember all these details. The sons that Bilhah and Zilpah had, they're not part of the 12 tribes, is that correct? Or
No,
are
they
some?
are.
They are. Okay.
Are, yeah.
And if that's the case, then I would say yes, they should be included. That's just a very
Yeah.
superficial answer.
Why would you say yes? Because the fact that they're the parents of the 12 tribes.
Yeah.
Be definitive for you. Okay, great. Louisa.
I think it's because potentially, even though he recognized them as his children, they were still illegitimate technically because he wasn't married to them directly. And therefore, I don't know, because it would be like somebody who sort of, even though they had their wives' permissions, they cheated on their wives with other people. So that's why it's hard to say whether they should be included in, because, how does that look in the dynamic of the real world?
That's really an interesting guess. Okay, I'm going to come back to that. Ed.
Yeah, just to detail from these stories, Rachel and Leah have the privilege of naming all the children, but the handmaidens do not bear that privilege, even though they bear children. It's it's their mistresses or whatever. It's the ones who have the authority, the women who have the authority to name them. And it's not that they shouldn't be included with the matriarchs, but it's interesting that there's a built-in lack of privilege, a structural lack of privilege in those stories that they have.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Karen?
Yeah, I was reading the lines that you taught us to read, and what's interesting is that when sort of Rachel is sort of fighting, having an argument with Jacob and saying, if I don't have a child, I'm going to die. And then so that's when she offers up her maidservant. But what she says is, consort with her that she may bear on my knees, and that through her I too may have children. So, I mean, the delivery is as if, you know, if she's kneeling while these women are giving birth, she's sort of play acting being the mother.
It's sort of like a surrogate mother in a way, like she's trying.
Yeah,
for-
like she's saying they'll be my children.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, oh, Maria.
I think it comes down to, well, for me, what's our definition of matriarch? A matriarch to me is someone who's makes decisions, good or bad, but decisions that are going to affect the dynamics of the family, of the continuing generations. And there's just not enough story here given detail as to what the two handmaidens, oh dear, there's the expression, the servants, what roles they played, if any. So for that reason, I'd need to know more before I would consider those two as matriarchs. To me, it's the definition. To me, a matriarch is someone who's like, this is how it's going to be. And, you know, even within the feminine world, the female world, it had some kind of impact and we don't know enough.
So you're really focusing on decision making, not genetics. Like genetically, they were the parents of the 12 tribes along with Jacob, but they didn't have the power and the privilege, as Ed said, to make the decisions about that. So you think matriarch really requires the power, the decision making. Interesting. I mean, because another way of thinking about I always think of the matriarchs as the founding generations, those first generations, in which case Bilhah and Zilpah should be included there. You know, they had a different class status. So they definitely did not have the power. They had a different class and they did not have the privilege. But in fact, we can't kind of look at our illegitimacy like from the 1950s memories of like what it meant to have a bastard child, because that wasn't the way it was done back then. Those children were 100% fully Jacob's offspring. And they inherited land. Like basically what happens is the 12 tribes end up in Israel and the land is divided up between those 12 tribes. Although, you know, the tribe of Aaron is going to be the Levites who sing in the temple and they don't get land. Like there's some complications there, but basically everybody gets their inheritance there, whether they came from what we would call like an illegitimate quote background or they didn't. But the status of those women was definitely different. And Ed pointed out a very interesting thing about naming, because one of the places women did have power in families was to name the next generation. And if you ever read the names of these 12 tribes, they all were almost as though these women were writing a journal of their emotional experience. You know, like the names are names that are so expressive of what the women were going through, the women who got to name at the moment. Like, you know, God has blessed me, or I was barren and now I'm, just the names are just intense. And even today, there's a lot of power in naming. You know, in choosing, like, who are you honoring through a name and what does the name mean? And the power of having a Hebrew name in addition to having a secular name. And that was one of the places that women had power in a private realm that wasn't public, but was kind of potent to name the next generations. So any other thoughts about Bilhah and Zilpah? And you may notice that when we're davening, I sometimes do include Bilhah and Zilpah. And I've noticed Kohenet Avra also sometimes includes them. And, you know, when we're talking about those. Ed?
Yeah, just, I don't want to get too peripheral, but about the lack of privilege among women compared to men. I you know, in our recent parshas, I think we just read about the Jubilee year And
Yeah.
it just crossed my mind that male servants, male slaves, were emancipated every 49 years, something like that. But there's no indication that women servants or women slaves were emancipated.
Yeah. Yeah, there certainly was not an equal situation back then. Paul.
Well, I'm just trying to take it at face value. And I think that the two women were employees, and so they had another role. They are the mothers of his children. It's just, it's funny, if this were going on now, the lawyers would be involved. They would be going to court and and we see it with some of the situations where like I think about Arnold Schwarzenegger and Maria Shriver, and yet his servant, they had a child, and that whole thing, for that person to get their due, it would have had to go through more legal. And so there is some, I think if you almost take it as face value, that the fact that they had a title that wasn't wife or girlfriend or whatever it would be, that would have had to get adjudicated. And yet, because that child is now blood of Aaron, so Aaron, yeah. So that means that they get the legitimacy. So the child does, but I don't think the servant does.
Interesting, Paul, because if you think about it, they were the maids in the home. It's very conceivable that they did the primary nurturing of the children, all the children.
Yeah, sure, but that was their job. It's almost like they did their job well, and they even took from the lady of the house, go and sleep with my husband. They didn't get so maybe we give them credit with an asterisk, but the truth is that they were not on par with the wives, or with they were they were tier below. So I don't know, but their children somehow became on the family tree, or on the genogram, they got a spot that was different than their own mothers. Yeah,
very interesting. And I think it's also, a possibility is that, we are reading those ancient families through our modern kind of sort of like heteronormative nuclear family, isolated, lens, whereas actually back then it seemed like it was a pretty standard practice to build the family by kind of sharing letting the men make the babies with a bunch of different women, just so that you collectively had a great family, building the family tree that way. And that the rivalry seems to have mostly been possibly even between Leah and Rachel, not the maidservants. I mean, that's not what might have been that part was not the problem in these situations. We just don't, I think families, our families in modern society are going through huge changes now with all the different kinds of, there's lots of polyamory, there's, surrogacy, there's all sorts of things. And, it's very possible that the expectations for what a family back then were not the same as what we're assuming now, maybe have been complicated or problematic. It may have been that was how you built a family, was you did these things. But each woman also wanted her babies, that's clear. And it was not happy when they didn't get to have their own babies. Sarah wanted to birth a baby, and Rachel wanted to birth a baby. And it didn't seem like they initially minded so much that also somebody else was making babies for their husband, but they also wanted that experience. Okay, Fran, is your hand up? Yeah.
I just had a question.
Yeah.
Is this considered patrilineal descent then, instead of what we now consider Jewish to be matrilineal descent?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah, because that's exactly right. I mean, back then, it's an interesting thing, because in biblical times and rabbinic times have different ways of counting that lineage.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very interesting question, I think, too, because it definitely went down through the father in that way, in the foundational stories of the people. And I think, if I remember right, that it was the time of Ezra, which was a very, that was a complicated time because we had been in exile in Babylonia for 50 years and came back into the land of Israel. And there were lots of rules made then by Ezra, and sort of the Torah was codified. All these oral stories got codified, and a lot of rules were made about who's Jewish, who's not Jewish, because there was lots of they were trying to preserve Judaism, and there was lots of interfaith blending because the families had, it was a complicated time, and it was a conservative time of kind of retrenching and making a lot of rules about it. And I think that the concept of it goes down through the mother was initiated at that time. And but now in reconstructing Judaism, you are Jewish if you have either parent is Jewish and you have a Jewish education. And in Reform Judaism, you are Jewish just if either parent is Jewish. So, and there's lots of complexities. Somebody actually just yesterday was talking to me about a situation where a non-Jewish egg was donated to a Jewish woman to make the baby. And that son grew up and is now very Orthodox. And he's concerned that he had a non-Jewish egg, which wasn't the mother, obviously his own mother, who raised him very Jewish, in a very Jewish family who are close friends of mine. But the grown-up son has become Orthodox and wants to do a conversion because he was conceived from a non-Jewish egg. And there were rabbinic discussions about this. Like, if you come out of the body of a Jewish woman, is that enough to count? Because clearly he came out of a very Jewish mother, but the egg came from a non-Jewish donor. So we have complications that they never thought of way back then. And I saw somebody's hand, but who is that? Okay, Meryl, you can unmute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is pretty current that in the beginning, children were the possessive of the man, and it wasn't until I think more recently that either parent could accept the child being theirs. But in the beginning, children were the property of the man. So there wasn't a question of who had possession of the child. It was always the man's property. And I think it wasn't until the 1920s that things turned around and either parent could have custody of the child. But in the beginning, it was always the father's property when a child was born. So
yeah, if you look at the history of heterosexual marriage, you always knew who the mother of a baby was, because literally the baby would be born out of a mother, but you didn't necessarily know who the father was. Back then, of course, there was not like DNA testing. And so one theory I've read at least, is that those property rights were created to kind of rope the men in and contribute to the providing and care of the next generation by giving them this property right, that this kid is yours, to kind of, and that, the world has just changed so much now that there is DNA testing, and there's lots of surprises in this generation of, as we have spoken about before. I guess this is a one-time phenomenon though, because from now on, everybody will know that DNA testing could reveal secrets. But back then, there had to be these social structures put around these things to make sure the men participated and didn't just go from woman to woman, impregnating people, but taking no responsibility for the next generation. And so the idea was, give them property rights, make them identify with protecting and raising this human being that's been brought into the world. So thank you for that. And Karen.
I have to add something just because
Okay, Bobby, then Karen, then Enid.
I'm sorry. And
Okay.
they didn't have Jerry Springer or Maury Povich to facilitate all these questions. That's all.
Okay.
It's true.
Karen.
Yeah, in the early days before, DNA, in paternity hearings, there would be judges who would bring the kid in the courtroom. I mean, I'm not talking about an infant, like a toddler or whatever, or older. And they would put the child next to the father to see if there was I mean, this would like blow my mind, literally, to see this, that they would make a decision based on the subjective perception of a judge. And a lot of times I would be like, I don't know who he's looking at, but I don't see it. And he would say, you're the father, you're on the hook for 18 years, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, I don't believe this. But yeah, thank goodness there's DNA now, but that's what they used to do.
Yeah.
There were judges that did that.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Enid.
Right, I'm just throwing this out because I don't have an answer. What about adoption?
Yeah.
How would all this affect adoption? You have the Jewish father who adopted the children of a non-Jewish mother, and they raised the children. Maybe the mother converted, I don't know. They raised the children as Jewish. From a legal perspective, how would that, or even a religious perspective, would those children, for example, be accepted in Israel?
That's a good question, because from the very most ancient times, adoption has been a Jewish practice, and it goes back to biblical times when there are stories of adoption in the Bible. Right. So it's a very ancient practice. And these days, of course, the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel, which controls marriage, wants conversions. They don't let you get married by the Orthodox and even ultra-Orthodox rabbis that control civil law in Israel. But because of the whole diaspora, other countries fought that the law of return would not require that stringent, so if you can just show that you're Jewish in some way, you're welcome back under the law of return, where any Jewish person, and defined very broadly, is welcome in the land of Israel. So there's two different ways of doing that. But in adoptive families, like in Reconstructing Judaism, there's the recommendation that you do an affirmation, like it's like a welcome. It's not like they're not Jewish if they're coming into a Jewish family, even if they were born from a non-Jewish person, but it's still an affirmation ritual in the mikveh. Like the immersion, it's like a conversion, but it's called an affirmation, because you don't want to deny that just because they're adopted into a Jewish family that it's like kind of rude to say that if you're coming into a Jewish family of Jewish parents, this child isn't Jewish. Of course they're Jewish, but there's an affirmation of that welcome that's recommended, and a lot of people do it. But the complicated thing is hatafat dam brit, that for boys, you're supposed to have the drop of circumcision blood taken in that situation. And so if you don't, you could be circumcised already, but not, you have to, in the conversion ceremony, have the hatafat dam brit, the blood withdrawn. Yeah. So that's like a little complication that I don't imagine most adoptive families in this world actually go through that. But the guy who was conceived from the donor egg is planning to do that, to go through the hatafat dam brit.
I mean, that's really,
because he's Orthodox and he believes the rules. Yeah, so that's kind of a challenge.
And I say the law really has not kept up with where things are today in that whole realm of marriage and family. Well, in many, many ways, we're way behind with all these, the in vitro fertilization and mothers, surrogate mothers, and all kinds of issues. But in terms of Judaic tradition, I just wondered you know, where all these complications have to be looked at
Yeah.
in terms of whether they're going to even take those things into consideration. I'm sure there are many discussions on all of this, but and particularly now with a lot of intermarriage.
There are whole rabbinic institutes in the Orthodox world that are devoted to these kind of,
Sure.
you know, because it's very legalistic. And in the Orthodox world, the way these things are done is someone can ask a question and they can ask a shaila, you know, they ask a question that's about halakha, and they get rabbinic responses called chuvot, like responses, response. And there are books of these things about things like surrogate mothers, donor eggs, whether embryos are life or not life, you know, all these fertility issues, there are Jewish perspectives on them. And it's
And I want to ask one other question, going back to Rebekah and Leah.
yeah.
Going back to the tradition from which those women came, were they the same or different from the tradition where the handmaidens came? Could that have been an influence?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I imagine the handmaidens came from the local environment where they were living. So they were probably, it didn't. Yeah, so let's move on to tracing that thread of the possible mother worship connection into Rachel's generation. Part of Rachel's story is that when she's leaving town from where she was raised with Jacob, she hides the family's idols under her saddle.
Yes.
Remember that part
Yes.
of it? And there's almost no information about, like, what did this mean? What was going on? So we have a lot of realm for kind of interpretation, imagination here, but we do know she hid the family's idols under her saddle as they're leaving. And so one theory is that, as archaeologists have found all through the Middle East, everybody had a hearth goddess. The Jewish families had hearth goddesses, the Canaanites had hearth goddesses, the mother goddess worshipers all through Mesopotamia and Assyria, all those places had hearth goddesses. And what they looked like, I actually have a beautiful poster, framed poster in my living room of one of these hearth goddesses. And they're in museums in Israel. You can see hundreds of them. But they were clay figurines that were kind of like a triangle shape. And the women would be holding up their breasts like this. And just that was what the hearth goddess was. And it was kind of presumably like a protective thing for your home. And it was just like a standard thing, sort of like a mezuzah. But it was also pagan. It wasn't just Jewish. But it was also like the Israelites had these in their settlements and their homes. And when these were first discovered by archaeologists, the Jewish establishment was like, no, that's not real. They weren't really Jewish. The Jews were like manufacturing them for the pagans, but that couldn't possibly have been true because they'd be in each home all through these Jewish archaeological settlements for generations. So, and they could have been, we don't know, but they could have been like sort of the women's religion, like you're managing your home and hearth in those cultures. And you're doing kind of the domestic, that's where you have your power and your ritual and your, you shape that life. And that they would have these religious ritual items, basically their sancta, as Mordechai Kaplan would have called them. The sancta is like the shofar or the mezuzah, or like the sacred things that we use. But the hearth goddess would be one of them. And so that Rachel was just taking what was hers to take, because that was her domain, would be to protect the home and hearth and enact those protective, blessing rituals. So that's a really interesting possible bit of evidence for this thread that Sarah was a priestess in the old religion, and that, Rebekah was also living into that by choosing a appropriate wife from her cultural heritage to pass on that to the next generation. And that then in Rachel's generation, those practices were still happening. Who knows? Does anybody want to comment on that? And then we've got a couple last things here I want to get to. The stealing of the hearth goddesses, Bobby and then Paul.
I just find this whole subjects, a plural, so interesting because I mean, it all goes back, or a lot of it just goes back to the question of Jewish peoplehood. What is a Jew?
Yeah.
Who is a Jew? And it's, I mean, I have members of my family, my extended family, my cousins and stuff. We discuss this stuff all the time because they are very, some of them are very conservative in their views, and they think my views are somewhat crazy. And it's just very interesting. And there are people in that family who there is a question about whether they're Jewish or not, or how to make them Jewish, and woo, it just goes on and on. So it's very interesting that we struggle with this and how many different views there are about it and how many different situations there can be.
Yeah. And these are very contemporary issues that also obviously were under discussion back then, because in the story of Rachel stealing the idol, why did she have to steal them?
Right.
Like, what was that about? Was somebody trying to keep her from bringing that? You know, if they were just her right and that was her realm of authority, why did she have to hide them? And, you know, so there's lots of questions there. We don't really know, but
And the hearth goddesses remind me of, you know, shrines and things that people, primarily Asian religions, put in their homes or at their doorsteps at certain times of year for certain holidays. I've seen it a lot in China and in Hong Kong. And it's just very interesting that we actually had that in our religion. Like,
one of the things that Dr. Mordecai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructing Judaism, lifted up was we should be looking at the folk practices of the Jewish people. We shouldn't just be looking at the texts, like all the texts were written basically by learned men. But there's a whole other realm of a resource that we can draw from, such as the folk practices of what people were doing. And a lot of the folk practices were the non-elite and the women. And they were things like the hearth goddesses or like amulets. We've talked about those before. So like really interesting potential resources for today's Judaism that weren't included in kind of the dominant Jewish mainstream culture that got passed on. Anyway, I said Paul and then Louisa.
Well, I've never heard of the hearth goddesses. I love it. I think they should bring them back. I mean, and you said that during the archaeological dig, they would find these. I would love to see what that looked like as sort of a representation, but I think they would be very popular now, you know, as to be able to think that, you know, as Jews, we have this wonderful little icon and we can put it in our homes and it really gives more response to women. I think it's terrific. So never heard of it, but I'd love to see what it looks like, and maybe we can get a little manufacturing going, right? Yeah.
Well, I'm really with you, but it actually is considered very heretical and idolatrous by mainstream Judaism. So it might put us outside.
Really? I think people, if you took a vote, somebody might like it because it's kind of a neat, you know, I can imagine, you know, you just wake up in the morning and you see the hearth goddess.
Feminist leaders have really lifted up these folk practices.
It's wonderful. Yeah. So I've never heard of it, but I want to see what it looked like just because I think it's a dimension that it gives more depth and breadth to maybe women from the past of our religion. So I really like it. I love that I hear it. Yeah.
Okay, Louisa.
Sorry about that. I was on mute. What I was thinking was maybe it was that she was afraid that they weren't willed to her because she was a female, and she was trying to protect them for future generations by taking them out before, and that this way her line would have them instead of maybe another line that was not as, I don't want to use the word faithful, but that is the way it is, faithful to the religion, to the practices, to the history. And since we do have other images that come through in the synagogues that are artwork, I agree with the previous speaker. Why couldn't this be a form of artwork that we maybe don't bow down to, which is what we don't believe in bowing down to idols, but it doesn't mean that we can't see the depiction of this or understand the depiction of this.
That's a really creative interpretation, Louisa, that maybe those hearth goddesses or idols, as they're called, would, belonged to her relative Laban's home, but she was afraid that she wouldn't have access to them in her new life because she was throwing in her lot with Jacob and his family tree, which practiced a different Jewish, at that time, evolving Jewish religion. So she wanted to bring her resource into her new family, and maybe they didn't belong to her. Maybe they belonged to her family's home and were supposed to stay there. Anyway, very interesting ideas. Couple last things here. In the prayers that we say about these matriarchs, Rachel always comes before Leah traditionally. It goes Avraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rachel, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, even though Rachel was the younger daughter. And there's been questions about whether, I spoke last time about whether we even do it partnering, like Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, or whether we just put the men separately and the women separately. But this is a different question. What's the order of Rachel and Leah there? Should we follow the tradition's choice that Rachel was the more loved one, the more privileged one, even though she was actually the younger one, or should we just do it in birth order? Quick opinions. How many people think Rachel should be first? Who was the one chosen by Jacob? Should she be first in the prayers? Raise your hand if you think so. Fran thinks so. Okay, interesting. Fran, you're in a minority here. How many people think Leah should be first because she actually was the firstborn? Okay, well, interesting. So what we do in our congregation is anybody can say it any way that speaks to them. So you actually can do this in a way that works for you. I want to also say that I hope that these early biblical stories open up our minds about what a family can look like, because we live in a very narrow historical snippet of history, which is that the nuclear family is kind of the way to do it. It's turned out to be a disaster mostly. People get very isolated. You don't have like a collective of helping hands around you. A lot of times you're geographically very far away from family and cousins and nieces and nephews and whatever. And for tens of thousands of years, the way human life has actually been organized is in much more tribal collective spaces where you actually do have a multiple of people living together. I wanted to sort of open our minds to that probably the way we've currently organized the nuclear family is not the healthiest and most, kind of contributing to human thriving and surviving, that much more relationship and support and village-like life is probably more helpful. And the collective families, like we see in the Bible, where you actually have these handmaidens who are sisters and multiple wives, and you have it's kind of sprawling, might be a better way to do it. I don't know about you. I love watching those shows and reading books about like polygamy, where people actually are, that there's like harems and sisterhoods, and in the Mormon religion, there's a lot of stories, and Sister Wives, stupid TV show, but I liked watching it. It was kind of hokey. But I think it's really interesting to think of the family in bigger ways than we have kind of been handed it in these very small set of decades. It's not the way humans have done it over the years. Okay. I want to say the two last things, and we're going to close with our closing song. Rachel died in childbirth. She had two children, Joseph and Benjamin. We know the story of Joseph because he's who ends up getting thrown in the pit and going to Egypt, where we later become slaves and Exodus from Egypt. So Joseph's a very key part in the story, and his mother is Rachel. But she dies in childbirth with the younger brother, Benjamin, the youngest of Jacob's kids. And ever since then, Rachel has been a symbol of both grief, hope, and everything around fertility. And in Israel-Palestine, there is Kever Rachel, the grave of Rachel. It's actually in the West Bank. And there's a fertility ritual that's done there by Jews all over the world. I've gone and done it myself, where you take red thread and walk around Kever Rachel, the grave of Rachel, 7 times. And then you make a bracelet out of that red thread. And so there are networks of women all around the world who wear the little red bracelets as a sign of fertility. And it could be fertility about actual procreation, birth, or about something generative in your world of work or relationships or social change or learning or something you want to be, fertile in. That's not necessarily about born babies. And those Rachel's red thread is a thing even unto this day of like using that kind of spiritual legacy around both the grief and the yearning and the possibilities in those areas. So wanted to say that, and to say also that I mentioned the women's prayers called techinas. I taught about it at a service a few months ago. I want to invite each of you to think about these matriarchs and to think if you were crafting some kind of a poem or prayer or paragraph of writing, and you were invoking these matriarchs, which one would you invoke for what? Like, what would be your connection, your personal connection? And if anyone wants to do any writing about that, send it in to me. I'd be really happy to share that. It doesn't even have to have your name connected to it, or it could at some future service that we do, because there's a space in Jewish prayer services for these heartfelt prayers connected to the matriarchs, and they're called techinot. Okay, folks, wonderful series. Thank you again, Wendy, for your vision and writing it up, and Education Committee for moving it forward. Let's close with our prayer for learning Torah, our song prayer. For our teachers and our students and the students of our students, we ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say amen. Chaverim, I am hoping to see every single one of you next weekend for our annual meeting. Bobby, do you want to make a little announcement? It's going to be really special this year. Oh, you're on mute, Bobby.
If you have not yet registered to come to the annual meeting in person and plan to or would like to, today would be a great day to register. Seriously, we do need to know how many people are coming. We're planning a nice brunch. Our new choir is going to sing. It's going to be a lovely, lovely time here at the Kennedy House Community Room. So please register, even if it's after today. We need to know. You can call me, you can email me, you can register online on our website, text me, whatever works. Thank you. And beyond that, tomorrow night we have our book discussion on the weight of ink. And of course, Wednesday is Shimano. And I will leave
And
it.
Bobby, we did decide we'd have a Zoom link for the annual meeting, which will go
Yes.
out. But we very much encourage people, if you're local, come, because it's a very special time to just be actually together in a space.
There will be a Zoom link going out. We haven't publicized that yet. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you
Love to
all.
all.
Karen,
Thank you all.
I'm going to stop the recording here.